this topic, and in fact, I mean, what's actually, I think, working so well is this topic, everything it was intended to kind of build on itself. So the topic here was precision medicine. We actually have a panel that actually are folks who have kind of come up and even helped define the field to working between therapeutics and diagnostics to being in diagnostics in the next area. And I want to kind of go back a little bit to where Mark ended a bit on this, because we have the reason why precision medicine and the whole strategy here of MassBio going forward is this notion of value. And the idea here of value was actually that if we cannot deliver value to the patient and have that value being highly realizable, then we're not going to have the capacity to open up for innovations. And actually, the cost of that's going to be to the patient, actually, ultimately. And that's where one of the things we've agreed, even as we kind of crept in here, is the patient was going to be the centering of everything we're going to kind of do in here. The other part of it is there is a presidential initiative that came forward, and I think, you know, part of David's arrival into the industry side from transitioning out of Broad was probably one of the more dramatic entries, which was being featured as part of the presidential initiative in precision medicine. But that initiative itself was not just a traditional funding mechanism. If you kind of look carefully, it was kind of targeted at an ecosystem. It was actually kind of talking about, can we build a national network of folks that would actually participate in the collection of data around patient? Can we actually start to build changes in regulatory pathways? Can we actually kind of change the context for approvals? Can we kind of change, so it's actually recognizing that if we're actually going to change how patients can realize innovations, we actually are going to have to change more pieces of the ecosystem and how healthcare all the way from discovery through to full reimbursement actually takes place, but we actually kind of have to build some of those foundation elements. So that's the context that we're taking about this, and so what we actually thought is we're going to let each of the panelists, because this is an area in a field that's kind of getting redefined, it kind of has a lot of background, but we're going to let the panelists give it their own definition. We kind of asked them to kind of give a sense of where, you know, some examples that fit that definition. We're then actually going to talk about what's necessary to kind of liberate us to actually move to precision medicine and get to value going forward. So in fact, we're actually looking for their perspectives, points of views, and even recommendations. Some of these can get translated into policy. And what I'm probably going to do is, rather than doing a bulk intro, let me just kind of go one at a time and then let each of them give their comments. But David, we'll start with you. And David, you know, joined Vertex this year, as I kind of said before, came in kind of around this notion of precision medicine, but background really is one of the founding members of the Broad Institute, and as part of that, really helping kind of bring into clinical practice everything from new target validation, drug discovery, up through new medicines of genomic medicine, and bring it into full realization. So maybe with no further ado, I'll kind of open up and let you lead, and then I'll do the rest of the introduction of each of you.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, and thanks for having me here today. I thought what I would do is just take a couple of minutes and start with how we think about the definition of precision medicine, and then talk about you know, sort of the steps to getting there. And I could certainly talk about our example or examples from us, but I'll probably hold that off unless you want me to go through that. But I think that there are lots of different definitions. The term precision medicine was coined, or not coined, but popularized by a National Academy of Sciences report. But the way that we think about it is really medicines that target the underlying root cause of a disease that is shared by some defined set of people based on a genetic or other means of knowing, that because they get at the root cause rather than symptoms, have the potential to modify the course or even cure the disease. So that's sort of the definition we would use. And we do use, and obviously we think a good example of this is for cystic fibrosis, Kalydeco, which was developed by Vertex Pharmaceuticals, that you know, cystic fibrosis, the root cause is the mutations in the CFTR gene, and the medicine specifically addresses the underlying defect caused by the mutation. And when patients take this medicine, they have not only benefits in things that are very proximate, like their ability to move air in and out of the lungs, which is easily measured, but also they gain weight and their lives improve. And we have shown that in fact there's a decrease in the decline over time. And so that's sort of an example, a very specific example. I think the key point I would make about the President's initiative and sort of the path from here to there is to realize that although this whole science is founded on understanding the root causes of disease, and that is absolutely necessary, it's not sufficient. And so I think it's important to realize that any time there is an understanding of this biology is underlying this disease, it will typically not be the case that an existing medicine already exists that can be applied. It will be necessary to develop that medicine. And that typically takes, as we know, 10 years or more, an investment of, people estimate, $2.5 billion. And so we have to realize that the kind of investments that were described to build the foundation are not going to immediately lead to medicines immediately simply by testing people for those variants, but we have to think about how we're going to actually make sure new medicines that address those mechanisms can be developed.
Okay. So let me go, Walt, I'll go to you. I'm just going to go in the order that you kind of coincidentally sat down. So Walt Carney is the Chief Science Officer at Nuclea Diagnostics, and actually you've had the interesting part of the career, whether it's kind of OSI, Bayer, et cetera. I've actually kind of been on the therapeutic side to the diagnostic side. I will say, I'll go back to Mark's comments, you have actually been successful in gaining reimbursement in a CPT code for a diagnostic test in the past. So, you have that. I thought I'd call that out because that's a non-trivial accomplishment here. But well, let me turn to you to kind of give part of the definition as well.
Well, I've been very fortunate in my career in the sense that we discovered the circulating form of HER2 many years ago and actually developed it into a blood test and took it through CMS and got a reimbursement. And actually it's being used in metastatic breast cancer patients today. So a lot of my background is really working in diagnostics and therapies. And I think what's been the most learning for me is that we now know today that women are very benefiting from Herceptin and endocrine therapy, but we always use the primary tumor to really stratify patients in the metastatic setting. But what we've learned over the last 5 or 10 years is precision medicine used to be picking the right drug for the right patient. But what I've found out is you really need the right test at the right time to give that drug at the right time. And the example is, in the primary setting today, women are been told that they're HER2 negative or estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor negative. But by the time they get to metastatic cancer, they actually could be positive for one or more of those markers. Yet doctors use that original information from immunohistochemistry and FISH to treat in the metastatic setting. So you have different groups of women now. I mean, there's a lot of talk about triple negative breast cancers. Well, not all women with triple negative breast cancer are triple negative. In the metastatic setting, 40% of them can now be progesterone positive and could receive endocrine therapy, but they don't get that opportunity because of the original information. So, I guess having had that experience, some of the things I've learned is we need to help physicians understand that that a test isn't right all the time for the patient. So many docs, and I talk to a lot of oncologists, always use the primary tumor information to treat their metastatic patients. And there are women there who are not getting these benefits, but they could. And what we've seen over the years is the women who were not eligible for Herceptin-based therapies are not eligible for any other HER2-targeted therapies. So again, I go back to precision medicine. I think we've done a wonderful job in the last 10 years stratifying women into HER2-positive and HER2-negative populations and estrogen receptor and positive negative. Now the next step is to define them even further so that we're at the patient level really giving the right treatment at the right time and as early as possible. And we're now seeing that, as women receive HER2-targeted therapies, they're beginning to resist that therapy earlier than anyone expected. So I've always been sort of a blood-based person. So, I really want to see more blood tests that are done during treatment, because at the biochemical level, we can see progression a lot sooner than we can see it on CAT scans and see it through symptoms. So I think, as we get more precise in our testing, we have to have better biomarkers, and I believe at the blood-based level to really catch these, the progression earlier. And I see cancer a lot like bacteria. If you can get those tumors when they're smaller, and just like when you can get an infection when it's smaller, you got a lot better chance of improving quality of life and also extending life. So again, I think precision medicine is really putting the diagnostics together with the pharmaceuticals. And having been part of a company that had both, I really encourage pharmaceutical companies to try to put in place a diagnostic unit that can take a product from biomarker to finish into an IVD, into the clinical trials. Trying to put these big companies together, and I've tried it, diagnostics and pharmas, and make it work is very, very difficult. But I found at Bayer that there was the opportunity to build this diagnostic unit within the pharmaceutical department that could actually take the biomarkers and actually implement them into some clinical trials.
Right, thanks, Paul. So Sue Hager leads the Corporate Communications, Investor Relations, and Government Affairs, which, again, in diagnostics, leading that portion has to be particularly interesting. And
it is these days.
Yeah, sure it is. For Foundation Medicine, and obviously Mark made reference to that before as a company, but also I do want to point out your background. You've also been on the pharma side, so you've kind of seen the therapeutic side at Bayer, Coley, et cetera. But perhaps kind of you guys represent kind of a newer model also coming forward around kind of the intersection of diagnostic, treatment selection, et cetera.
Yep.
Give your definition.
So this is a perfect segue because I think what we're all understanding now is that cancer really is not a disease of a body part, right? It's really a disease of the genome. And at Foundation Medicine, we are a molecular information company that's really an enabler of precision medicine from a number of different vantage points. So first, we have 2 commercial tests that determine the underlying genomic drivers and genomic alterations of a person's unique cancer. And so what we do is, whether it's a solid tumor or a hematologic tumor, with just one sample and one test for one cost, we can give a physician a complete portrait of the underlying genomic drivers of that patient's unique disease. And not only do we give them that genomic profile, but then we take it one step further and we match it with approved targeted therapies, or if there are none currently for that specific mutation or that genomic driver, then we'll recommend currently enrolling clinical trials with drugs that are targeting that specific alteration. So, we truly believe in this, right target for the right patient at the right time. Separate from what we're doing with patients and physicians is that in the process of doing this, we have amassed a genomics database now that has well over 35,000 profiles of tumors. And that database, which we call Foundation Core, is wholly informative for our more than 20 pharmaceutical partners now who can query that database and look at particular genomic drivers and use that information to help inform their clinical trial strategy and their clinical decision-making process to bring targeted therapies to market. So we're really approaching this from a very comprehensive perspective. With the test that, number one, we believe is the most comprehensive and predictive of all the markers that are driving a patient's tumor, and then also working with pharma companies to help them deliver precision medicine. So we really, again, see ourselves as an enabler. I think, for Foundation Medicine, we come at this from a very patient-centric approach. So when we think about what is the definition of precision medicine, for us, it's all about what does it mean to the patient. And it's an opportunity for that patient to go beyond really what is standard of care or chemotherapy, and to have an improved quality of life because we were able to identify a unique marker that then gave them access to a targeted therapy that can help them live a better life and treat cancer like, just a chronic ongoing condition and help them live their life to the fullest while they're on this cancer journey. As it relates to the President's Precision Medicine Initiative, the policy side of me says it's a good start. Very optimistic and encouraged by the $215 million that President Obama would like to set aside for this initiative. I think it's important because for the first time, the federal government has unambiguously committed to precision medicine and has said that this is an initiative that we must participate in as a nation. So I'm delighted that there is this national spotlight on the initiative. But the other side of me says it's a good start, and it's going to take a lot more money to really move the needle to where we need to be.
Okay. So I want to maybe go back to this notion of both a example, but then also kind of link it a bit to how precision medicine links to this notion of value. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm going to intentionally try to kind of keep this, part of our conversation we had was not using the term cost, because if you use cost, you're talking about a negotiation and a constraint, and you're not looking at value, and you all of a sudden don't become patient-focused. But I think this notion of value keeps it patient-focused. But I want to link to one thing that was in the President's Precision Medicine, but it was this notion also that they had interoperability considerations. So there was an interesting emphasis on actually meaning the ability to integrate data from multiple sources throughout the health ecosystem, as well as deploy decisions. And if you kind of take that notion, it's kind of saying, hey, we're in a system, we're going to get some system scale and some network effects we never saw before, and we're going to be able to accelerate these insights. So I'd like to kind of get this notion about how this idea that we're going to have greater access to data information than we had before, and we're actually going to get accelerated insights. If I listen to each of you, we're going to get accelerated system, individual insights. How do we bring that to bear in a useful way on this notion of precision medicine to kind of link back to value, if you will?
Want me to start?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I think that again, I start from the premise that while we'll get some benefits from existing medicines, at least in my experience thinking about the genetics of disease, in most cases when you discover the new relationship to disease, there is no medicine. And so I'm going to focus at least my comments on how do we get to the place down the road where not only can we find a link and a marker, but we actually have anything to offer for that patient. And I think it does speak to your ecosystem comment, because it's pretty clear that the discoveries that will relate particular genotype or other way of characterizing patients to an outcome is typically done in the academic or public sector. And although there will be important contributions of many sorts from companies, the scale is bigger than any entity, and especially I think we're going to see whether it's done, by a foundation medicine or academic groups or whomever, millions and millions of people having their genome sequenced, and we need to mine those patterns. But once they're mined, all that does is set you up to go into a laboratory and start to ask, can we understand this system? Can we actually develop an assay? Can we develop potential treatment? And that is most typically done in companies, can sometimes be done in academia. And then even if you do that, you have to actually go through the clinical trials, the regulatory path, you have to get the medicine to patients. And that's all done clearly by sort of pharma and other, and then it goes back to the healthcare system to figure out how do we deploy that diagnostic and that therapeutic. So it is a systems property. And I think that first of all, the emphasis on information flowing is really important, because today it's not very easy for companies, let's say, to get access to that information about the genetic relationships. It may not be that easy to turn it into diagnostics, move it through that process. And so I think that maybe I don't want to go on too long, but the implication of recognizing that process and that there's a huge amount of investment by many parties along the way is that it is important to think of it as an ecosystem. I heard, Mark, your comments, and think of it as a systems property. And I think it's also important, and it is one of my take-home messages, that we not engage in simplistic thinking about how simply, and I'm going to focus on genetics, although it's not the only means, simply sequencing genomes will lead to better treatments because we'll just match everything up. Because at least as a physician and a scientist who did genetic research for 25 years, most of the time you make those discoveries, there is no medicine yet, and there's like a couple of $1 billion in a decade of work to create it and then get into that world.
Good.
Yeah. I think maybe just to follow up on that point is that we're thinking about a massive paradigm shift, right, in the way healthcare is delivered, not just in cancer or in rare diseases, but just universally. And this whole notion of precision medicine, which was personalized medicine and now is precision medicine, so it's an idea that's been long in the making and much needed, is one that's really going to require a lot of very innovative thinking, not just from pharma and diagnostics companies, but really I believe it's going to take a combination of public-private partnerships to drive this forward, some innovative thinking, some pressure from advocacy groups, patient advocacy groups. And I think if enough people put enough pressure on the system, then we can force the change. But it's really going to take all of us to think very differently about how we leverage information, access information, and how that information, importantly, gets to the hands of patients and physicians.
Well, I think our biggest challenge as an industry is we have lots of information, we have lots of data, we have new therapies, new tests, but how do we deliver them to the doctors so they really understand what they have to work with, and how do we get them to the patient? So I always focus on the patient and work backwards, and I can tell you in my experience, one of the toughest things to do is introduce a new test to a group of oncologists because they're used to immunohistochemistry, they're used to fish. And when I talk to them about a blood test, they go, "My God, we treat people with statins on blood tests all the time. So I think we, again, as an industry, have lots of innovation, we have lots of information, but how do we nail that down so that we can provide physicians with, information that's sort of stratified to the patient? And so, and I think advocacy is a great way to go. We've done a lot with breast cancer advocacy because we realize there's such power in advocacy. So we've done a lot in trying to train the advocates about HER2 and bringing that to their patients and start the discussion with their physicians that there's not only tissue testing, but there's blood testing. So again, as an industry, we have an incredible mountain of information, but how are we going to, bring it down to the point where, the physician 30 miles outside of Boston is actually going to be able to use that information to treat the patients. We're all used to being in Boston and being around the major medical centers and knowing the top docs, who are doing all the innovative research. But again, you go outside of Boston, outside any major metropolitan city, people are practicing medicine that's a little bit older.
Right.
So again, the value is informing and teaching the physicians and bringing the physicians and the patients together, I think.
Yeah, and maybe just to pick up on that point too, because this is a really important one, is that we can have the best innovation, but unless we make it simple and have it integrate seamlessly into clinical practice at the point of care, whether it's in an office setting or in the pathology lab, it won't be adopted.
Yeah. So I agree with all that completely. I think, though, the other thing that we need to recognize is, while it's true that doctors do move slowly, and they tend to be highly influenced by multiple large New England Journal papers that actually show benefit, and they do. I mean, if you look at the uptake of statins, there was, it was very marked that when New England Journal papers were published showing the long-term benefit, all of a sudden actually use went up. And so there is a challenge to our innovative industry, which is there's one paradigm, which is, I'll say, is the paradigm that Vertex is working under, where you actually commit to the years of investment doing those trials and showing actual benefit on hard endpoints and biomarkers that are proven predictive, as opposed to a paradigm that could be used, which is to say that we see a biomarker and we see a drug and we say, hey, health system, it's your job to figure out if that's helpful or not.
Sure.
And so I think that we will see more. I agree with simplicity. I agree with focusing on the doctors and everything. But I think there's also a real paradigmatic question as to whether or not we're going to be able to design a path that is fast and nimble enough to be realistic and yet actually will show value to the patient as opposed to theoretical possibilities.
Time to
Yeah.
treatment is too slow. I'm sorry.
Right, no, go ahead, I was going to say the same thing. Exactly, regulatory pathways have to be much more embracing of innovation.
Right.
So can I tease this out just a little bit more? Because if I listen to each of you, there was a sense that we're going to have an information flow that's actually going to be increasing. And in fact, quite frankly, we can look and say the amount of data that we're now producing on patient populations, whether it's out of electronic health records and then from other sources, is actually increasing substantially every year. There's been a lot of research actually looking at the processing time and speed, and the capability of that is also increasing greatly. So theoretically, within 10 years, you could almost go from insight to a practical application at a speed that we couldn't do before in that setting. But you're describing something where we're not set up to practice that way kind of yet, right? So how do we move from the description of the possible where we know there's high benefit to kind of what's going to make that more practical to actually integrate into a live clinical setting?
Well, one comment I'll make, and the others may want to pick up, because you mentioned advocacy groups before, and I do think, I don't know if Kathy's still here, but I think that advocacy groups can play a big role in the history of the cystic fibrosis example. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation played a catalytic role in a number of ways. It's well known that they raised awareness and they raised money and they invested catalytically in developing the products. But the other thing that in supporting that effort, which was done at companies, but they supported it. But I think that the other thing that was important along the lines of what you're saying is an organized patient group where there's registries, where there's natural history studies, where enrollment in studies is facilitated is a really important, I think, pre-competitive contribution, because I think both in terms of getting rapidly to the kind of studies we want to see have happen, but also being able then to get back out to the patients and families. In cases where it's better organized, it can move much more quickly than if we're just going to the entire healthcare system without any such help.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I've, since I'm a little bit older, I have the advantage of looking back, and advocacy has become so powerful and so useful in the sense that, and I'm used to breast cancer advocates. They bring information to us, they talk to us, and then they translate it back. And I think part of the president's initiative, and I don't know how to do this, but maybe there needs to be a guidance of that initiative for how we use a population of our people to sort of, from the ground up, start to really go down this road of precision medicine. As an industry, we're big, we got a lot of information, but sometimes we lose the fact, and I see this all the time, in metastatic breast cancer patients who are said they're HER2 new or they don't have ER/PR. In fact, they may be positive, but now we've lost this, this patient because they're put in two big buckets, and they happen to be in this bucket, so they're kind of screwed. So we need to, sort of maybe at the advocacy level, start to bring this information up and get that into, into the government and start talking about this, because, we are talking about individuals with cancer, and we treat people, we put them in buckets, but we're all genetically very different. They're going to require different treatments. So I think there needs to be, from my point of view, we need to start with the patient and work backwards.
I'm going to ask one question, then I'd actually like to open up a little bit to the audience, particularly given who we have here. But let me just frame a couple kind of elements here. And if I kind of go back to, Mark talked about a cycle of sort of 3 decades and 3 drug cycles kind of going forward. But if I look at the context we're sitting in today, 2014, some of the data came out and said, okay, it's a 14% increase in therapeutic spend within the economy, largely driven by the influx of more specialty therapeutics. Germany, I was over in Europe last couple of days, and the same thing phenomenon occurred in Germany. So we're going to see it, going across all economies. Forecast was that for the next decade or two, we're actually going to see, because of how successful we've been and because of how successful biopharma has actually been, you're actually going to see an absolutely greater increase in the amount of therapeutic entities going into almost every single therapeutic area. And it's a little back in increasing use of combination. That pace is actually underway, and in fact, in certain categories, there's 1 new launch per month actually that's taking place, going on, paces we haven't seen for a long, long time, which is a very, very good thing for patients. But some of the pace we have here, if you could enable what you just described, that could be deployed in a high-value way. What would be catalysts to accelerate a little bit of the ability to put some of what you described into place? Because the concern I would have is you got a system that's going to see a higher cost without the tools of how to deploy for value. And kind of is there, so and it could be your counsel in terms of policy directions or other component, but how would you kind of confront and enter into that area? Because it's certainly part of what we're actually debating in MassBio right now, kind of as well. And I know it's a tough question, so I'm sure, well.
I think a lot of it's about education.
Okay.
I can give you an example of years ago, we had an employee who had a relative who had pancreatic cancer. A bunch of us got together and we brainstormed because we happen to be in this field. Yeah. And we actually figured out some therapies that might actually help this person. And so through a lot of, searching and information and getting to the doctor, we were able to inform that doctor, here's some other alternatives. And actually the patient lived for, a few more years with pancreatic cancer. But I think we need science to be understood by more people in our country. Yeah. And we need to educate, maybe we start with the advocates, but I think if we are educating our population more about what's available, that might help.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, just to add to that and it's a comment I made just a few minutes ago, is that I think our regulatory policy has to change in order to keep pace with the rapid rate of innovation that we're experiencing today. And I think particularly the FDA, at least in our space with lab diagnostic tests and their recent decision to try and regulate those, has done a really good job thinking outside of the box and thinking about how they can ensure patient safety and accuracy of the data without stifling innovation. And I do think it's going to take the FDA and other regulatory bodies to think differently about how they approach new innovations, and that even goes to, who they hire, who's elected. It runs the gamut, but I think that's probably a key driver. And then it goes hand in hand with reimbursement. I hate to bring it up, but it's going to take some very innovative payers to think differently about what value means to their organizations and to their patients, and how they can assess value of innovation that's being brought to the forefront now.
Yeah, please.
So two quick comments. One is just to pick up on the FDA and thinking outside the box. You know, in our experience, working, you know, getting the CF medicines to patients, to families, actually has taken a lot of innovation on the part of the FDA, and we've actually found them to be a terrific partner, and new
Us too.
pathways like
Us too.
accelerated approval and breakthrough designations and stuff have accelerated our paths, and they've just really been terrific in our experience in saying, how can we make this work? So I do want to give them a lot of credit for that, because it's been a really very positive experience for us. I think that the real answer to your question, not in terms of how we all deal with this as a society, is to focus on value to families. Like when we look at our situation, which is you know, really been tremendous to join, you know, there's sort of easily measured things, but there really is, you know, when you think about a disease, at least like cystic fibrosis, where it's not just the children and the people with it who still die at age 24, median age, and who spend hours a day doing their chest therapy and can't go to school, and their parents then takes over the whole family, and the parents have a hard time working. And when you can show reductions not only in their sort of easily measured outcomes, but in the time they're in the hospital and the time they have to spend on that the parents go back to work, that's one type of value that I think can then be rewarded. And I think the other is that I'm optimistic that if you look at the cost of, not the cost, but the investment required to make new medicines, it is dominated by all the expense in clinical trials that doesn't succeed, and it takes a long time. And I'm at least optimistic that if we actually focus on where we understand the disease and where the medicine is really attacking that, you'll be able to do what again, some examples have seen, which is you have smaller trials, they're more rapid, you have bigger effects.
Yeah.
And that in the end, although you might have to invest a bit more early on in this research to understand the relationships and building the platform to do that we might find that the whole process becomes of higher value, because we're not spending as much time on late stage things that don't work because we didn't really understand what we were doing.
Yeah, as I listen to each of your responses, actually I'm kind of struck by a couple of things. One is, you described almost a cultural attribute of, we need to have a different conversation, and we actually may need to put the data behind the conversation, have more confidence when we go into that, and a little bit even what I heard you say in the regulatory one. I think the second one is, we probably have the data, can see the data, but we've never put it together and told the story and presented it in the way that you just described, because historically that hadn't actually. So I think, you know, and that's within the realm of something we can actually manage and take care of today. Let me kind of go out and just see if there's questions here, kind of in the audience. Yeah, it's a little hard to see because of the light sometimes, but.
For Dr. Altschuler, you mentioned the CF example as being one that was very positive with respect to the regulators, and I'm just curious if there were any particular elements of your communication or your application that contributed to that positive outcome.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I think that there's at least two things that have contributed to it. One is the FDA on its own and has really put forward a number of pathways aiming to accelerate precision medicines, and Janet Woodcock and her team have been really focused on that. So that's one part of it, is that without those defined pathways and approaches, it wouldn't be possible. And then I think the other is a close partnership, because in each of these cases, at least that we've been doing, you come across unprecedented challenges. I think that you can't simply throw it over the wall and expect it to work, and not that my colleagues have done that, but rather saying right from the start, look, this is what we want to achieve, and it seems like, and we agree with you, that it matches the pathway. So how do we make that work? And continuing that discussion even after you've submitted. And we found a lot of good faith in that, and it's been productive, but I think it is challenging when you're doing things that haven't been done before.
Right. Charting a new course.
Charting a new course, and I guess the idea that you have to chart it in a collaborative way, because you know, it has to work for the ecosystem, and I think that it has to work in a way that's sustainable. You know, we might have our one file, but they have to worry about all the other. Each of us have our one thing we might do in any given period of time, and they've got to worry about how it works for everyone, and so we have to all recognize that.
Yeah.
Yep, please.
Yeah, question for Walter on the challenges relating to simultaneous approval of a therapeutic with its companion diagnostic, and how do you coordinate the reviews at CDRH and CBER-CDER? Because obviously, if there's a disconnect with its market entry, you don't capture the value that the diagnostic brings to that therapeutic.
I certainly don't have the answer to that. As part of Bayer Diagnostics and Bayer Pharma, I saw the challenge. The diagnostics didn't want to invest in a companion diagnostic because they were afraid the drug would fail. And when we did do diagnostics, it was usually too late for the pharmaceutical division because they were ready to go to phase 3. So I think it still is a challenge of bringing the companion I mean, I think the companies on their own have done a good job bringing RAS into the picture and HER2 into the picture. But I think going forward, there's got to be a much more efficient way of doing this. Mm-hmm. And I thought the answer was, having all this under one umbrella. But then, you could see it was clearly the diagnostic division didn't want to spend a lot of money developing a biomarker that may never see the light of day. Mm-hmm. So I think, again, I don't have the answer. I think there's a big challenge, but I think more cooperation between diagnostic and pharma companies, and I'd like to see more pharma companies actually put in place IVD level diagnostic units, and I think that could really accelerate things. Mm-hmm. But pharma companies were really afraid to do that. And a lot of pharma companies I talked to are afraid to put in that diagnostic element.
I think there's also just one other thought about that. I think that there's the diagnostic part of it, but as you pointed out, and I just want to pull it out because I think it relates what both of you were talking about, which is being able to monitor the disease over time. And it's not just, it's sort of the diagnostic, but there's also the biomarkers of efficacy, and in cancer, maybe some of those even become the same thing as you watch different clones come and go. But I think that if you really innovate, and if you have a program where, like, here's something that no one's ever done before for the disease, and there isn't a standard way to even, to measure that benefit, even if it's with a standard machine, it might be, with an imaging device, figuring out how if it's not an existing regulatory endpoint, and yet it's the readout of the biology that's been newly discovered, how do you create that? So even though it's not exactly a diagnostic or a patient selection marker, then it's a measure of efficacy. I think that's another, you got this sort of order of events problem where, like, how do you get it recognized as a regulatory endpoint if it's never been possible to change it before you invented a new medicine that can benefit it?
Right. And, just to the 2-minute commercial on Foundation Medicine, I think that's one of the things that investors find particularly interesting about our company, because we are, at our core, a molecular information business. And so our pharma partners can then do just that, right? They can query our database to help inform their clinical strategies and companion diagnostics at the same time.
What a lot of people don't realize is pharma has a lot of these diagnostic answers, but they actually don't realize it. There are a few pharma companies that have come to me over the years and said, they developed an IHC test for such and such a drug or a blood test, but they didn't have the internal structure to actually take those forward. So there is a business model where, diagnostic companies work with pharma companies, and they take these antibodies or these blood tests that have already been discovered as part of clinical trials, and they take these and they develop them in concert with the pharma company, and these are the tests that could be used in pharma clinical trials. But again, there's an incredible amount of intellectual property in the pharma companies already that is useful for diagnostic companies to take off with.
Well, and actually, just to add one last thought to that, often it's actually in the research stage that you discover that there's something you might want to measure in the blood or in the tumor, and then you have to figure out how to make that. And so, if you don't start early, you'll never have it.
Right.
Absolutely.
But then how do you get it through those it actually is clearly an issue of how do you get it from the research lab where you used it to show that you were getting benefit into something you could use in your clinical trial first. It's very challenging.
You build a gigantic database.
Yeah. That's how you come up with the hypothesis, but you still have to develop it.
So as I'm listening to the three of you, if I kind of just reflect back a little bit on the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, there was a model there of actually doing the genetics before treatment, relapse, building that longitudinal. Each of you is also kind of talking about a model here of building up that longitudinal. Is there a basis here where some of this maybe you want to consider pre-competitive in a different way than we did historically to make sure that data accessibility exists, not to be
Well, I mean, I think that if you look at the president's initiative and others like it in other countries that are quite frankly further along, there is an idea that there's at least a pre-competitive foundation, foundation of information.
I know, you guys are just
that
reinforcing the brand every
that's right,
3
there
minutes.
you go.
It's great.
There you go. No, but I think that there's clearly got to be a pre-competitive foundation of information. Again, you know, not to wear my former hat, but if we didn't have the Human Genome Project in the public domain, and if we didn't have all the genetic variation and cancer variation, there would never have been any of these advances.
Yep.
And while it's absolutely great to have private entities go and create their own value add, we need to make sure, and that is, I think, where the president's initiative is aimed. I think one thing that is critical is that we have interoperability. I was involved in starting something called the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, which is now over 250 organizations, public, private, around the world that are just focusing on the interoperability piece. That if you could just figure out how people talk to each other, and that's it's very much based on the World Wide Web Consortium example, where the World Wide Web Consortium doesn't build the websites, it's not Wikipedia, it's not a DNS server, it's not Facebook, but what it did was make sure that there was actually some interoperability so that an ecosystem could evolve. And I do think whether it's Foundation Medicine or a public database or Bayer or whomever, if we can't all talk to each other at least and do transactions, whether there's money, you know, whether there's charge involved or not, you have to be able to do the transactions. Don't take for granted that will happen.
Yes.
I guess just following up on what.
Why don't you, if you could wait just 1 second for the mic, it just,
Thank you.
and then after that, I know there's one behind in the back as well.
On following up on David's comments about other countries being further ahead, could you just elaborate on maybe some of the countries that are the most committed to this, and are they just putting money in it? What are they, do they have a different approach?
When I said further ahead, let me just be very clear. What I meant was specifically with regard to creating sort of national databases, not in the field more generally. So that not in the science and not in the companies and things like that. So let me be precise about what I meant. No, for example, I'll use one example. In England, there's both a biobank, which is 500,000 samples. It was started about 10 years ago. They've already done genotyping on almost everybody. There's 100,000 samples being sequenced. There are obviously countries like in Sweden and Finland and in around the world, Iceland. And so there are just other places that, in terms of creating that early foundational information, have organized the sort of population resources ahead of what this initiative is really focused on, is creating that foundation in America. I think if you ask where does the innovation come from, where are the methods, the devices, the discoveries coming from, I think if you were to put a pin where we are right now and just go concentrically, it wouldn't be a bad representation of where a lot of it's coming from.
Yeah, and I think that was also, just to follow up, part of the president's comments too about trying to bring the U.S. Up to the tier where other countries are in terms of their own database building and amassing massive amounts of patient information. I think one of the things that tends to hold us back is privacy and protection of data, and making sure that whatever we build is built smartly. But I know I can say from our own experience, when we talk to patients, they are more than willing to turn over their genomic information for the betterment of others who, you know, may be dealing with similar cancers, or they have similar genomic alterations and drivers. We see patients more and more forthcoming with their genomic information and wanting to share it with the broader population.
I know there was another question in the back, and then I'll come to Glenn.
This is a great panel, and I commend MassBio for having it.
Thank you.
I wanted to, I guess, ask two things. One, can you bring us up to date on the expansion of precision medicine into immunology and neurology, because I think those are ripe areas? And is anyone looking at the implications of precision medicine for medical devices, which are better for people, which might not be so great depending on genomic variations? I do find the FDA seems pretty far behind on that aspect.
Well, I can make, go ahead.
No, okay.
Well, I was going to say, you know, a couple of comments I can make in terms of diagnostics. The other thing we need to recognize is that not all diagnostics tests are created equal. And I think, I'll give you an example. Today, a woman can have a test to see if she's eligible for HER2 targeted therapies. If she gets the test from company X or gets the test from company Y, she can get two different answers. One test may give her the eligibility to Herceptin, the other test won't. So I think there needs to be a level playing field here that, we always approve tests usually with about 80–85% concordance between tests, but there's 10 or 15% of people who get caught in this discordance and they may or may not get a particular drug. So I think from a medical device point of view, we need to do a better job of making these tests more consistent. And there needs to be maybe a higher level of comparability. And I mean, this has been a topic that's been widespread in the HER2 field for 10, 15 years. Whether you have your IHC test or FISH test done in a small lab or a big lab. So I think the device industry has to do a better, and maybe the FDA has to do a better job of making sure that we as consumers are getting the right information and you're not getting the information from a particular test that may or may not be correct.
So the only thing I'll add is to your point about devices, there are initiatives now that are because you don't have the same information that you do on therapeutics because of the approval 510K predicate device. The data set isn't as rich as it is actually on therapeutics. Right. You do see initiatives like United Healthcare got together with sets of provider systems and created a company called Shared Clarity, which is integrating EMR and claims data and trying to actually assess real outcomes and outcome differentials across different devices, both positive and negative on that. So there are kind of some initiatives around it, particularly passive devices as opposed to active interventional devices that are there as well. So.
I mean, one other comment you asked about neurology and other areas. I think immunology. I think Alzheimer's disease is going to be an interesting example to watch in that regard. There's a hypothesis, as people are very familiar with, probably the amyloid hypothesis, which has to do with where there's very clear genetic evidence that at least in subsets of patients that hypothesis plays a causal role. There were many agents developed. They were tried in all comers and at least have not been successful. And now after many years, people are going back and doing trials that in some cases were discussed almost a decade ago, which was taking the people who actually have the genetic mutations and trying the medicines in those individuals. And so it's going to be interesting to see. That's a case where, I think 10 years ago, it wasn't necessarily at the front of, that was discussed, by the way, in different settings, whether or not those trials should focus on people who had the genetic cause, but it being a smaller population, it wasn't seen as popular an approach. And now it'll be interesting to see, does that end up working? And if so, how much more quickly would we have gotten to an answer if people had focused on where the evidence was that this mechanism was playing a role? But that time will tell.
And a little bit of that same spirit, immuno-oncology, because we're actually mixing these two and we're bringing in target therapeutics, goes back to Mark's points about layering in lots of combination approaches. That area is also starting to get early but growing scale of attention around it in kind of some of the same way we've been discussing. Glenn?
I think the area of immunology is growing quickly as well. I mean, there's many companies developing peptide vaccines, and we're now activating T cells, subsets of T cells that are actually able to go in and eradicate, tumor elements as well. So I think this whole area of, our own immunological responses being activated to attack the tumor are making pretty great advances.
Yeah, completely agree.
So
we can hear you either way.
So one of the things that I found most striking about what Kathy Gusti said this morning, and sure she went through the whole litany of progress. It was a remarkable progress in understanding the sort of dimensions of multiple myeloma and the multiple sort of targets and disease. Mm-hmm. And then she talked about herself as what she felt like in the end, as she talks to patients, that she was the concierge to the rich and famous, were her words. Because she found so many people, and so many people who seemed to be pretty well informed, ended up actually not understanding some of the basic tests and how to think about it. So it was sort of everything there in many ways exists, but patients were not, for some reason, being availed of it or informed about it. And I was wondering whether this is something that goes back to kind of Mark's point about we have to be careful not to optimize all the different silos and then have it not sort of in the end, optimize the collective result, or if there's just something more basic and maybe it isn't even technological.
Yeah. The only hopeful comment I would make, just as a counterpoint, is in the case of again, cystic fibrosis, what's been remarkable is the uptake of our medicine. It incredibly rapidly got to high rates of utilization, and it sort of stayed there. And speaking, and again, whether that has to do with it being parents of children, whether it has to do with this social network and foundation of advocates that exist, whether it has to do with how well my colleagues did at the company, so I'm sure it's some of the above. But I think it is a hopeful comment about how rapidly something that really works can be taken up, and just a counterpoint to the concern that maybe doctors and families and all, we can't make it all work.
Right. I think, too, one of the challenges in dealing with cancer in particular is that as a patient, and I speak somewhat from personal experience with family members, is that as a patient, you don't have months and months to get educated, to figure out what the right questions are that you need to ask your physician. You have like 3 weeks, if that sometimes. And that's probably the biggest challenge, being a patient facing a disease that is that overwhelming. And so one thing I can say from Foundation Medicine's perspective is that when patients or their physicians come to us to have a comprehensive genomic profile to identify, what's happening as a genomic driver of their disease, that we hope to empower them with the right information in a way that's highly actionable for their physician to have a smart conversation with their patient, one that's informed by the underlying, genomic mutations, but then also to help the patient truly understand what's happening so that they can go back to their physician and ask the right questions, or at least have a family member who is educated quickly to be their advocate.
I would also say we're lucky as Massachusetts to have, MassBio Tech Council that's actually bringing a lot of the silos together.
No need for me to ask a question then, Mr. Moderator.
That was your cue, actually.
Thank you for that, Walter. But David and Susan, you both hit on a point. When you talk about, especially something like Foundation Medicine, and if it's difficult to get traction to have the physicians drive that change, when there is a change, how do they drive the utilization? And we've also talked about how do you get the FDA to keep up with the pace of innovation. That's something that you can utilize, biopharma, MassBio, and especially the disease foundations.
Right.
And when you look at the fact that now in a day of social media, and parents talking to each other, I'm going to put on my CF dad hat now. I mean, we can mobilize to work with. I mean, I have significant concerns and questions about the FDA because I don't understand why you can't get to my son's specific mutation. Kalydeco, next generation corrector isn't going to work, and even third generation corrector. So we got some issues like that you want to speed up. You look at the Foundation Medicine piece. I mean, how do you get patients to know that they can do that when they immediately just take their doctor's word for it? That might be a protocol that's 10 years old.
I think that one of the points you just raised, and I think I was just realizing it as we had the discussion, is there are a couple of very different situations we find ourselves in, and it's probably worth parsing them. Whereas there's one where, let's say, the disease has a slow enough course and is known in advance that you find and also for whatever combination of reasons, people are educated, motivated, like they have time to process it and get through the stages and then get to, I understand this, I want to actually move and make it happen. And then there's situations where it's a very rapidly moving situation, it's more of a crisis mode. And it's probably worth noting that there's like quite different scenarios, and maybe the need for prior education versus at the time is very different depending if the pace is you have to decide in 2 weeks versus it'll take place over a decade.
In defense of the FDA, they also get a considerable amount of information or clinical trial data that's not very good. And I think in talking, I went to an FDA meeting a couple of years ago, and one of the speakers there was saying, they get a lot of information, they get a lot of clinical trial material that's just not good. So that bogs them down. My experience with the FDA is they were incredibly helpful. We went to them with the clinical trial. It was very good. They had good people. We talked science, and we got this. We got our blood test through the FDA. I think they respect good science. I think they get bogged down in people trying to fight back with stuff that's not very good. And I think maybe we need to, I don't want to say build that infrastructure because it is difficult, but somehow we need to get better science to them so they can move quicker.
So since we're almost out of time, but what I would like to do is maybe give each of you, just to make sure that we got, your most important message on the topic. Maybe if we just can kind of go through each one of you. Maybe Sue, we'll start with you, Walt and David.
Oh, I'm very clear. It's, getting the right test at the right time for the right patients. I'm sorry, did I?
That's all right.
No, that's,
No, it's all
No,
right.
that's my
That's a good
message.
message.
Okay.
I think that could be a focus of our future.
Okay.
so I guess can I have a few messages?
It's all right.
So I think anytime you're trying to change a paradigm, it's difficult and it takes time and it takes everyone to come to the table with their best thinking, their most innovative thinking. Doesn't mean it can't be done, it takes a lot of time and resources. And so with this precision medicine initiative, I'm very optimistic that maybe we're at the point now where we have enough of a spotlight on this that it's going to move the needle in the right direction. We'll actually see some great tangible results come out of this initiative, whether it's probably not this administration, but administrations to come, just for the amount of time it's going to take to move the needle. Second, if I could leave the audience with a message, particularly for those who may have loved ones with cancer, all I can say is, and this might be a message that you would echo as well, just don't guess, test. Make sure you truly understand the genomic drivers of that disease, because cancer is an N of 1 disease. Every tumor is unique, and you really need to understand what those drivers are to make sure that you are getting the right therapy for you at that time.
I truly believe that we live at a time that will be remembered in history, and a place, frankly, that will be remembered in history as when we really moved the needle on the understanding of human disease, not just model systems and cells and basic properties, but actually the understanding of human disease, and we're able to turn it into the kinds of precision medicine with companion, diagnostics needed to make this work. I think that it has the potential to really change the course of disease. I was too frustrated as a physician caring for patients at how often we could, slightly dent things or delay them a little bit, but there were cases where you could really transform it, and certainly at Vertex we aim to make transformative medicines. Sure. But it's going to take time, and I think we really have to see this. And I do think that for organizations like MassBio, and since we do live in what I, as a lifelong person who's lived within 3 miles of here my entire life, which is actually true, that I care about it happening here, that this is about our kids, this is about our grandchildren, this is going to take decades, and that it is about the quality, as you said. We have to focus on making the best treatments and diagnostics and proving their value, and I think society will come along and value it, and that it's not about, can we figure out how to make it just fast and everyone gets to innovate, but that we prove that value and it will work. And I believe we are going to have the foundation to do it. There you go again. And it's our job. It's our job to be committed for the long run, and not just sort of find some markers and connect it to something, but actually make the new medicines that will really cure disease.
So I appreciate the comments of everybody in the room and the panel. I think this idea of kind of relentless insistence on the insight and the use of that insight for treatment, which we heard from Kathy this morning too, including even changing where you do treatment, I think there is a catalyst there. I think clearly each of you spoke to how and what we can do to get value. Clearly there's a process, but I'm also kind of hearing with some real focus, insistence, and drive against it, that in fact we can make some progress against it. So again, thank you for all your time and for coming together and all your prep as well.
Thanks.
Thank you all too. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.